Welcome to the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, Election Interference. There will be a Q&A session at the end. If you'd like to submit a question for the panelists, please do so in the Q&A panel. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome virtually to Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. I'm Ted Wittenstein, and this is session number 4 of the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, Election Interference. We will introduce our terrific panelists in just a moment. As a reminder, all attendees have their volume and video muted, but we're eager to incorporate your questions. You can do that by submitting them using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And we'll record this session and distribute and post the video afterwards for the benefit of everyone. For those of you turning into the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum for the first time, this is the 4th of 7 bi-weekly Thursday webinars taking place this semester, focused on the theme of sovereignty in cyberspace and bridging the divide among the law, technology, policy, business, and academic communities on the most critical cybersecurity challenges. Professor Ona Hathaway is our forum director and my partner in cybercrime since we first launched the forum in 2017. She's the Gerard and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law, Director of Yale Law School's Center for Global Legal Challenges, a faculty member at the Jackson Institute, and we're grateful for her visionary leadership in putting this all together. We have a great group of Jackson Institute and Yale Law School students who are part of the forum for class as well. You can view their bios at cyber.forum.yale.edu, as well as learn more about this vibrant program. So our 5th session is going to take place in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, April 1st at 12 p.m., focused on organizing to address cyber threats and moderated by our colleague David Lashway, chair of the Global Cybersecurity Practice at Baker McKinsey Law Firm in DC. So now let's turn to today's special guests. Nathaniel Gleicher is the head of cybersecurity policy at Facebook. In that capacity, he works at the intersection of technology, policy, and law, managing a wide range of cyber challenges confronting the social media company. He's a computer scientist and a lawyer, a distinguished graduate of Yale Law School. And in the Obama administration, Nathaniel served as director for cybersecurity policy at the National Security Council, where he developed U.S. policy in many of the areas we've focused on throughout the forum, including encryption, cyber deterrence, internet governance, and network security. He's a well-known public authority and commentator on the full range of cyber matters, and he's been a key partner of ours since we've launched the forum a number of years back, and we're delighted to have him with us. And we're thrilled to have Ellen Nakashima with us, an award-winning national security reporter for the Washington Post, where she covers cybersecurity, counterterrorism, and intelligence issues. Her reporting on Russian election interference in 2016 and contacts between aides to President Trump and Russian officials led Ellen and her colleagues to win a Pulitzer Prize in 2018. She also was part of another team that was awarded the Pulitzer in 2014 for her reporting on US government surveillance and its policy implications. Ms. Nakashima has held senior leadership positions at the Post for a number of years, to include stints as a Southeast Asia correspondent and White House correspondent. And given the constant rush of deadlines and breaking news coverage, we're so pleased she could be with us today. So thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, Ellen, for being with us. I'm going to let Ona kick off the discussion. And remember, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, which I'll help moderate later in the conversation. So thank you very much, and over to you, Ona.
Thank you so much, Ted, as always. We're so excited to have you here today to talk with us about the question of election interference. And I guess I want to start, Nathaniel, with defining our terms here, sort of getting on the table. What do we mean by election interference? So our previous sessions have talked about cybercrime, cyber espionage, cyber warfare. That is efforts by malicious cyber actors to steal, manipulate, destroy data and critical infrastructure. But election interference doesn't necessarily target physical infrastructure. It tends to target perception. So can you say a little bit about what we mean when we talk about election interference? What from your perspective, does Facebook see as this kind of disinformation?
Sure. Thanks, Ona. And I'll say first, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back, and I'm glad we're having this discussion again. I think it's really interesting. We've sort of talked about these issues a few times over the years, and each time they seem to evolve. Ellen, we've certainly talked about these issues a few times over the years, and each time they seem to evolve. Starting with definitions is, I think, a really good place to start. It's interesting, just a couple of days ago, there was a report out from the DNI on what they saw around the 2020 elections, their assessment on the threat and the targeting of it. And they actually used two linked terms that I really appreciated. They used the term election influence to describe any effort to manipulate or influence an election using sort of covert or overt techniques. At Facebook, that might include a network of coordinated inauthentic behavior, which is a term that we define to essentially mean any group of pages, accounts, and other assets that are working together to mislead people about who's behind them, to deceive them, or to manipulate public debate. It could also include overt efforts, like, for example, state media or other efforts where you're not concealing who you are, but you're trying to push certain narratives into the election discussion. So that's a term for election influence. And then they defined the term election interference as a subset of election influence, where you are explicitly attempting to break the technical systems on which an election relies, whether that's vote tabulating or actually enabling people to cast their votes. And having this distinction between election interference and election influence, I think, is really useful. One of the challenges we often have in this space is we talk about disinformation as if it's all one problem, when the truth is it's a lot of different problems. And when you're thinking about elections in particular, there's a really interesting feedback loop between election interference and election influence that makes being precise about them really useful. One of the things the DNI said was, there is no evidence that foreign actors engaged in or were able to interfere with the election, that is, manipulate any technical systems upon which the election relies. One very common technique of election influence is to claim that there was election interference, right? To try to undermine trust in the election by claiming the systems were hacked, the systems were unreliable. And many, many people from the Department of Homeland Security, from external experts, now the DNI, have been unanimous in saying, effectively, this is one of the most secure elections, maybe the most secure election we've seen in the United States in terms of election interference. And that feedback loop is important, because one of the best ways you get ahead of the election influence operation is by being very clear about what did and didn't happen. There is no evidence that there was election interference, and having authorities say that and back that up makes it harder to undermine trust in the election. So the way we think about it at Facebook, all these pieces connect together, as you might expect. Tackling a challenge like this, you have to have companies, government, civil society, and the media all focused on how you tease apart what happened and what didn't happen, to focus people on authentic public discussion about the election and about the results.
Great, that's fantastic. And that's a really helpful set of distinctions that you just laid out. We didn't have the advantage of having the DNI report when we initially planned this session. Otherwise, maybe we would have called it election influence rather than interference. So Ellen, as Nathaniel rightly stated, it's interesting that the DNI report, and maybe we can put a link to it in the chat for our viewers, does seem to have come to the conclusion that there doesn't seem to have been persistent efforts to gain access to election infrastructure this time around, at least. And in fact, it specifically said, unlike in 2016, we didn't see persistent Russian cyber efforts to gain access to election infrastructure. And that instead, it does seem to have been much more an influence campaign. And perversely, I mean, as Nathaniel, I think, helpfully points out, creating uncertainty about whether there's interference in the election infrastructure is a form of influence, because it creates uncertainty and lack of confidence in the outcome of the election. Can you say a little bit more about what you saw? Maybe for those who haven't had a chance to see the DNI report, maybe a little bit of kind of some of the rest of the sort of general conclusions about what 2020 looked like and what the interference or influence campaign was when it comes to the 2020 election.
Sure, and thank you for having me be part of this. I'm really glad to be here, glad to be with Nathaniel, and looking forward to this discussion and learning from you and your audience as well. So what a difference 4 years makes, right? 2016 to 2020, I was on the front lines of covering the 2016 election, and we were not prepared for what we saw. I don't think anyone, not even the intelligence community, really was expecting a Russian effort as audacious as we saw, and as a result, we weren't prepared. Neither the U.S. government nor the public, the social media companies. We were all kind of caught off guard, and we learned a lot of lessons from that. Yes, as you mentioned, Russia tried to hack they tried to hack election county registration websites. They got in a few. They never managed, though, to actually get into voting machines, change any votes, any ballots, but they did try. 4 years later, we were so much more, I think, aware of the issue, prepared for it, even expecting it, that there was just a lot of attention being paid. And the social media companies, of course, had surged up their forces, created war rooms, were taking down also thousands of accounts, even several years back to the midterms. And there was just a lot more awareness, public awareness of what this might look like. And media too was more sensitized, in fact, to how I think the Russians could have had an impact. And one thing in particular we were looking for was something along the lines of a hack and leak, which is what they did in 2016, as you might recall, with hacking the Democratic National Committee and Democratic Party servers, and Hillary Clinton's campaign manager's email, and then dumping them online through WikiLeaks, which then had an impact on the public debate and conversation through the media, through the news networks, and all of that fed into a sort of what you might call what was an influence campaign. So this time around, we were much more sensitized to that. And in fact, I think because there were more protections in place, higher level of public awareness, Russia couldn't pull off the same surprise again. And in fact, they also didn't have the same attack surface. The systems, both at the state, local levels, at federal levels, the actual computer systems were more secure. The candidates themselves, I think Joe Biden wasn't as vulnerable or exposed or likely a target as Hillary Clinton was in 2016. For all of those reasons, I think Russia wasn't able to pull off as big an influence campaign as they did in 2016. And then, of course, maybe the biggest point is, in the end, it was domestic disinformation, domestic influence efforts that I think had a far larger impact on the 2020 election and the electorate, far more divisive and sowing discord than what Russians or Iranians or anyone else could have tried or did.
Let me follow up on that a bit, because I do think one aspect that seems to have been interesting in this election in particular is that the sort of hack and leak didn't seem to have the same kind of impact. So the sort of Beau Biden leak didn't seem to have the same kind of impact that the Hillary Clinton emails leak seemed to. It also seems to have been the case, I mean, as you just said, that a lot of the foreign interference is more amplification of domestic misinformation. And were we prepared for that? How did media companies treat that differently? It does seem to have not had the same kind of impact this time around, which does suggest that we were sort of better prepared for it. Was that really intentional? Was it just we learned our lesson in 2016? Were there systems in place differently in media companies? Why do you think we seem to have been a little bit more better prepared to not allow that to sort of shift the narrative completely? Not that it didn't have any impact, it had obviously had some, but what specifically did we do differently, and what should we then continue to do differently to try and address this threat going forward?
Okay. Well, there were a lot of lessons learned. At the Washington Post, for instance, I think there was a bit of an internal reckoning where we gradually kind of came to terms with the fact that maybe we didn't handle the 2016 hack and leaks in the most appropriate way. I've shared this before with Nathaniel and others, as I am on the national security desk. And so in 2016, I was seeing, in fact, I broke a story about how the Russians hacked the DNC in June of 2016, the story. And then about a month later, when all of those emails, because at the time in June, we thought this was just classic espionage, Russians hacking in, doing what they always do, taking emails and using them for their own purposes to understand what the potential next president of the United States might be thinking. But then in July, when all of a sudden these thousands of emails started appearing on WikiLeaks, I knew it was the Russians, that all of a sudden I knew that they had taken their game to a new level. What we were looking at here was a form of information warfare, and that they were actually trying to do this in order. This was in the middle of, just as the Democratic National Convention was about to begin, and they wanted to have an impact on that convention and stir it up. They were releasing some of the most embarrassing, you might want to say, emails that were in the DNC that kind of got at that narrative that the DNC leadership was in the tank for Hillary and biased against Bernie Sanders. And of course, all the political reporters seized on those emails because they were kind of juicy and they fit the narrative. And those became the headlines and dominated, in a sense, the coverage for that week, led to the resignation of the DNC chairwoman. And here I am thinking, wait a minute, but this was a hack by a nation state, by Russia. They're trying to disrupt this, political convention. That's a news story. But that point kind of got lost in the bigger political picture or story. And I think this time around, we wouldn't do the same thing. In fact, our executive editor, Marty Barron, put out guidelines in September. So a few weeks, couple of months before the election, for the newsroom, the entire newsroom, about how to handle a potential hack and leak if we should see something like that again last fall. And some of the main points were, if this sort of news of this dump comes out publicly, we don't just rush to reflexively cover it. First, we're going to look to see, is this information authentic, one? And two, is it newsworthy? Do we really care that this is John Podesta's risotto recipe? I mean, how newsworthy is the substance of this material? And three, who put it out? What might be the motive? All of those elements go into the decision about whether or not to even report on it, and then how to report on it, and report on it responsibly, to include the fact that, who might be behind it and why, and what their motive is. And I think more news organizations took that framework, and I think, the social media companies were also thinking about that too, and I'm sure Nathaniel will want to weigh in on that. And in the end, we didn't really see a major hack and dump, right? Burisma, the company on whose board Hunter Biden served, was hacked, but we didn't see a big dump of Burisma emails in the same way we did in 2016. And as you pointed out, the laptop story, that weird convoluted story about Hunter Biden's laptop that supposedly turned up in this Apple store in Delaware, it didn't gain a lot of traction amongst the real, mainstream media, I think precisely because we couldn't really determine who was really behind this, right? Was this really authentic? And but by the way, was it even newsworthy, right? The real news is in what is Joe Biden and what his foreign policy is, not whether Hunter Biden, couldn't keep his laptop secure. So.
Yeah, and that was striking. That seems to have been maybe a lesson learned, hopefully, that we all sort of took a step back, took a breath, rather than sort of jumping into reporting what sort of was clearly, intended to be planted as a kind of story to take off. Nathaniel, I want to turn to you. So we've heard for Ellen a bit about how media companies have tried to sort of inoculate themselves in advance against this sort of hack and dump, and to be more thoughtful about reporting. in the lead into the election and not be caught up in the same kind of, sort of being manipulated through a hack and leak. How did Facebook and other social media companies prepare differently in 2020 than they had in 2016? Did they similarly have other kind of system structures in place to try and head off the kinds of problems that we saw in 2016? What do you think though is done differently that helped inoculate us to some degree, at least from some of the worst effects of an influence campaign?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is like, we could talk about just this question for a very, very long period of time. There's a lot of meat here, but I'll offer, I guess, three things. One, we'll talk a little bit how the preparation happened. Second, I'll talk a little bit about what I think is a positive note. And then third, I want to sort of end on a cautionary tone, because I think there's a few different pieces here. In terms of preparation, I mean, it is completely night and day between the social media platforms in 2016 and 2020. And I think that's true across the board. Ellen started by pointing out that I think the biggest transformation, if you think about this from a social media platform perspective, in 2016, Russian actors targeted the election. We were catching and exposing these operations after the election. For the 2018 election, working together with law enforcement and others, Russian actors again tried to target the midterms with a sort of with an influence operation. We caught and exposed that in the weeks or days before the election, just ahead of the vote, warned people about it so the election could go forward. In 2020, we were taking down influence operations that Russian actors were creating, likely to target the election a year in advance. And that's just a radical difference, right? And it's a difference because you have, in 2016, across society, I don't think we're ready for this. By 2020, you have determined teams within government, within civil society, at the platforms, and at the media organizations that recognize these threats and are thinking about how to tackle them. I think it's extremely important and significant that we, as we got into the waning days of the election cycle, the social media platforms and government, we were meeting weekly. The FBI, DHS, the DNI, and the major social media platforms were talking about what are the threats we're seeing? What are the trends we're seeing from overseas? What do we think might happen and how do we get ahead of it? We now have a team of more than 200 people that are focused on these types of issues at Facebook. And that includes engineers, it includes product managers, it includes policy experts, it also includes investigators, people from law enforcement, from the intelligence community, from investigative journalists. And we've built a model. So I joined Facebook in early 2018, and my team was created in part to respond to the recognition that there are adversarial threats out there. There are actors who want to misuse the platform and are going to continue trying to misuse the platform. And the way you deal with an adversarial threat is different than the way you deal with sort of one piece of violating content. Because any control you put in place, you have to expect that your adversary is going to try to get around it. And so you have to build your systems using the principle of adversarial design. How do you design a system to be resistant to determined adversaries? And by the time we got to 2020, we'd been spending years building that model in. Now, that doesn't mean 2020 was perfect by any means. I think there were a lot of challenges around the last year. And I should note, in the United States and abroad, it's worth noting that shortly after the US election was the Myanmar election, another critical, heavily targeted election with a very different set of risks and challenges. But I do think from a preparatory perspective, we began preparing for the 2020 election in mid-2019. And one of the first things we did is run a series of red team exercises to identify what the likely threats would be and begin to prepare for them. And one of the things that was really powerful for us is we identified 9 major threat trends. And we used those to prioritize our investment. And all of those 9 threat trends ended up coming to pass and being important components of the discussion. And the fact that we and others were thinking about this so far in advance meant that you could sort of be ready for the pivots. So the second question is, what did happen and how did the response play out? And I think here, the biggest takeaway of the election and of the DNI's report, which I think frames this very well, influence operations have been around for a very long time. They are not new. But I think after 2016, they achieved this mythic perspective that they were all powerful. But the truth is, if you look historically, influence operations tend to be high risk, often failing operations. they are often unsuccessful. They can be very successful, but they aren't always. And what we saw in 2020 was a reminder that even against a determined set of adversaries, if you have a whole of society response, you can contain these attempts. And for the 2020 election, we saw about 16 influence operations, coordinated inauthentic behavior networks that were targeting public debate in the United States. 11 of them were from overseas actors, 5 of them were from domestic actors. And we saw those over the course of the year of 2020. And I think if you look at the DNI report, you see the assessment that activity from Iran and Russia were directly authorized at the highest level of their governments, that these actors were trying to target public debate. And also an interesting note that Russian actors, there's an assessment that Russian actors were seeking to gather information that they could use for a hack and leak operation. So there's a lot of evidence that there was targeting. Now, when you look at what happened, though, you can see a lot of places where that, quite frankly, didn't pan out the way the foreign actors wanted. And the hack and leak conversation is, I think, one of the most striking. If you look at the coverage, and you were talking about this, Ellen, and I think Marty Barron's write-up is a really good example of this, but if you look at the coverage between 2016 and 2020, hack and leak operations are a kind of perception hack. The biggest change we've seen, because it's harder and harder to run these big networks of fake accounts, we see threat actors shifting to try to play on the fear that manipulation did happen rather than trying to actually manipulate. And a hack and leak operation is basically designed to take advantage of the speed of the news cycle. You want to get out there faster than anyone can get ahead of you, get the story anchored in everyone's mind so that by the time people grapple with it thoughtfully, it's too late. What happened around the efforts to do this, whether you're talking about Burisma or some of the drops from Derkach in Ukraine or the laptop, people engaged in a very thoughtful way. People took time. And the question, the key question was, where are these things coming from? Are they authoritative? And then they asked, okay, what's in them? Whereas in 2016, I think the whole debate was, what is this? This is really exciting, as opposed to what's happening? Why is this happening? How do we think about it? And that's a very important shift. And the last thing I want to say that is important, though, because this is a very positive conversation, and I think there are a lot of things to be positive about from 2020, is that I think there's also a cautionary tale here. 11 of the CIB networks we took down were from foreign actors. 5 of them were from domestic actors. Domestic actors targeting public debate within the United States. And I think the domestic dimension became a real challenge over the course of the year. And we have to remember foreign interference is an important challenge, but it is one challenge. And you can't just say, okay, we're tackling that piece. You have to understand deceptive behavior and these threats across the board. And I think going forward, there's a lot of work to be done. And that's an area where my team is really focused, both in the deceptive space domestically, but also globally around the world as we see these challenges proliferate.
Can I just piggyback on
please?
something?
Yeah, please.
And so, Nathaniel, I think you're absolutely right that the reaction this year was so different than 2016. When you say that there were 11, foreign operations and 5 domestic, numerically there were more foreign, but wouldn't you say that in terms of actual significance or weight or impact, the domestic operations had more impact on the discourse on voters? Because it's just my observation that no matter what the foreign actors tried, and in fact, in 2020, because they couldn't really gain traction going in directly, they had to work through proxies and fronts and going in through Ghana and Nigeria and trying to find, fool American reporters into thinking they were some NGO so that they could maybe plant some story in some obscure site. Whereas in 2016, they were able to go straight through to, get something on WikiLeaks and then inject it right into the bloodstream. In 2020, they had to take these much more convoluted routes. And then they were dropping stories like Andrei Derkach. You and I know who he is, this Ukrainian lawmaker who's been deemed a Russian agent, but do average Americans know Andrei Derkach, and do they care? What's got interesting is that Andrei Derkach he met with Rudy Giuliani. Now that's a name people know. And so I think the Russians were trying maybe through Giuliani to somehow get a narrative about Joe Biden into the mainstream media. But even there, it kind of failed. It fell flat. instead, the narratives that did seem to, have some traction were all I think domestic origin that then Russian or other foreign actors tried to amplify. So a lot of the Sturm und Drang and angst and confusion and chaos of 2020 was originated by domestic actors, and then the foreign actors sort of squirted the accelerant around the edges, was my general impression.
So what I think is interesting about that is if we go back to 2016, a lot of the narratives that Russian actors were amplifying, it's not like they were narratives that they created. They actually regularly would take content from real Americans and amplify it. And they would, and actually intentionally, and you can see this back and forth with the IRA actors from 2016, where they are pulling content from American actors, or they're seeding content in hopes that innocent, unwitting Americans will take it and amplify it. That same feedback loop existed in 2016, right? I think there's a couple of things that are different now. The first is the inauthentic efforts to amplify things were much less effective, whether that was foreign or domestic. And so we're talking about domestic and foreign, and I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. But it's also really important to talk about authenticity. So one of the things we've done, we break up this problem and we think online, we think about actors, behavior, and content in these three dimensions. And there's actually a researcher named Camille Francois, who's at Graphica, who's written up this framework, the ABC framework. She was the first one to talk about it, but a number of people use it today. And the idea basically is you can look at the actor behind a message, you can look at the behavior they engage in, or you look at the content they're spreading. And each of these are challenging dimensions. The content piece is by far the hardest, because the content question is something true or not. Does it constitute manipulation? Is it hate speech? Is it incitement? We have centuries of doctrine in this country about how gray these lines are and how hard they are to draw. And the consequences of drawing them are incredibly high. In the behavior space, where you see domestic or foreign actors using fake accounts, hiding who they are, being deceptive in their behavior, in the actor space, where you see something linked to a known bad actor like the IRA, I think in those two areas, you can make a lot of progress to tackle these challenges and reduce that risk. Content is really important, and it's always going to be one of the hardest areas. So I think some of what you saw between 2016 and 2020 was all of the defenders in the different places were able to take a lot of the threats in the actor and behavior space and reduce them. It's not that they're eliminated. These actors are not going to go away. They're going to come up with new techniques, but it's a much fairer fight, which means that in the content area, where you have really complex, really deep divisions across the country, it shouldn't be surprising that that's going to continue to be the core challenge and a huge driver. So I would say it's not so much foreign domestic as it is an authenticity question versus a content question. And in the place of an open debate about these issues, I think it's just a much harder problem, and it's supposed to be hard.
And I would also add, though, that the actor with the biggest megaphone, who had the biggest impact, I think, was the president of the United States. And I mean, his voice, his incessant tweets dominated and distorted the conversation. I mean, the IRA, LACTA, whatever agency is no match for President Trump on Twitter. And I mean, that alone, I think, just drove so much of the debate, the confusion, the discussion, the divisions, and exacerbated the divisions in the country. And of course, there's a big debate over whether or not it was right of Twitter to take him down, or Facebook as well, I guess, down his account. But you can't ignore, right, that the quality of the megaphone, the impact, the stature, I think, of the person who's putting out that voice is very important.
Absolutely. And I think this is the problem you're trying to point to, Nathaniel, if I'm not misunderstanding, is that when Trump is tweeting, we know it's Trump. It is Trump. It's authentically him, but he may be spreading information that is highly contestable, if not outright wrong. And so you've got an authentic speaker. It's not like, somebody's pretending to be President Trump. We know who he is, unlike some of these influence operations where they're sort of pretending to be Joe Schmo in Kansas, and it's really, some Russian hacker who's who's sort of pretending to be an American with a particular viewpoint to try and amplify a particular message. But so Trump is an authentic actor, but spreading information that at least many consider to be outright lies, and sometimes amplifying information from some of these inauthentic actors as well, right? So spreading some of these conspiracy theories, some of these actors who are out there who are of sort of uncertain origin, so that the two kind of interact with one another in ways that make it very difficult to control and put places like Facebook and Twitter in a tricky place, because then they have to manage content, whereas I guess it's kind of easier, it's sort of uncontested to take down inauthentic actors, much more contested to take down somebody like President Trump, who's much more influential, but is not pretending to be somebody who's not.
I think what I would say is the question, there's a set of choices here or challenges that are fairly uncontested, but there's a much bigger set of gray space. And you have gray space in the authenticity or behavioral context as well. And we actually saw a bunch of that around the election. So I think it is generally uncontested that someone who is running a network of clearly fake accounts designed to look like they're from the United States when they're being run from St. Petersburg, we should be taking them down. But there are much more challenging questions. So for example, in the physical world, campaigns have been paying people to knock on doors for a very long time, right? What happens when a campaign pays someone to use their social media account to amplify messages that are for the campaign, and they don't disclose on the social media account that they're being paid, and it looks like they're just a believer? We saw this around this election, and that is a much grayer place. And I don't think we have consensus around what should happen there. Now, I think there's a bunch of gray space in the content area, 100%. And I think there's a bunch of gray space in the behavioral area. But the core challenge is public debate as it exists today is a changed animal, right? I mean, things have really changed as the internet has driven public discussion, as the social media platforms have anchored it, and as all of these new formats have come up. And we are grappling as a country and as a world with what the lines should be like. And I think there are a bunch of things that happened in sort of the physical world discussion or in the print discussion where there were controls because of the friction of the environment. And as that friction has changed, maybe things that happened before, the harm is more increased now, and we have to figure out what the balance is. This is one place where I think actually it's really important to have some clarity and guidance from elected officials on where these boundaries should be. And of course, that is an incredibly challenging issue. You might be talking about a regulatory approach. You might be talking about commitments or frameworks among people. One of the things that we've done, my team put together a set of recommendations, which we put out in October for if someone was going to craft influence operations regulation or legislation, what should you do? And what are the things you could do that would be most effective? And where could you draw these lines? I think getting clarity on this from the democratically elected body is extremely important. And I also think it's really important for us to remember, we're having a very US-centric conversation here, but this is a global question. And there are a bunch of countries that are considering regulatory approaches, and many of them don't have the same commitment to freedom of expression and public debate as we do here in the United States. And so there will be approaches to this. But the thing is, if we don't figure out balances, someone else will take the lead. And it will be a country that is more interested in controlling the discussion, that is more interested in empowering the government. One of the hardest lessons that I've learned, because my team, we protected more than 200 elections around the world over the last few years. Certainly the 2020 election was a very big one, but there were a lot of them. The distinguishing factor of the 2020 election in the US is that we had government, civil society, media, and the platforms all saying this is a serious problem. We need to take this seriously, and we need to do everything we can. There are a bunch of elections where you don't have that. And in particular, when you're in a place where the government is part of the problem, it's much harder to strike these balances. And the other three components, media, civil society, and the platforms, it's remarkable how quickly they get outmatched just by the reality of the power that a government can wield within its borders. And that's by design. But I think it's a reality we need to recognize. If we don't figure out how to get ahead of these issues and think about them here, they're going to be thought about, and the results will probably not be things we're happy with.
Right, this is a key point, because these dimensions, these kinds of influence operations are happening around the world. And as you point out, in some cases, it's very much directed, the government isn't involved in combating it, but the government is involved in creating it. And for companies, the challenge of how to respond is much more complex, because do you act in a way that's inconsistent with what the government regulations? Do you follow government regulations if it's anti-democratic as opposed to democratic? That's a real challenge. And I think your reminder that this is not a US only problem is a really important one. And that these may play out differently in different countries. I wanted to follow up. There was an article some may have seen by Anne Applebaum and Peter Pomerantsev, I may be mispronouncing that, in the Atlantic that is pretty critical of social media companies. It argues that our democratic habits have been killed off by an internet kleptocracy that profits from disinformation, polarization, and rage. So not very favorable towards social media companies, as you can see. And one of the arguments that it makes, and this goes more to content, so I understand this isn't so much your area, Nathaniel, but I want to invite you to say something about it. And Ellen, you may have views about it as well. One of the arguments they make there is, Facebook can make its site, quote, nicer, not just after the election, but all the time. They argue can do more to encourage civil conversation, discourage disinformation, reveal its own thinking about things. How would you respond to that? I mean, they argue that part of the reason Facebook doesn't do that is because it's inspired by its own commercial interests, and it doesn't necessarily have the interests of the democracy and the American public in mind. And I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that, and also talk, I guess, about some of the complexities that you face in terms of making the internet nicer. Is that a realistic goal, and how would one go about doing that if one were to try to take up their suggestion?
Sure. Again, lots in there, but maybe two things that I think are worth calling out. So I've seen this argument before a number of times, and I think there's a fundamental truth embedded here that we should actually be talking about, which is, if you want to build a social media platform where people are going to engage, you need to create a space that they're going to want to be part of, that they're going to want to come back to, that they're going to want to spend time on. So it's not about creating engagement, it's about creating sustained engagement. You want people to want to be there. And one of the things that's very clear is that people react to clickbait. They react to extreme claims and all these sorts of things, but they don't want to spend all of their time around them. If you want to create a sustainable environment, you can't have an environment that's full of clickbait and incitement and hate speech and all of these other types of claims. It's just it's very clear to me from a sort of pure business perspective for Facebook, if it wants to build sustainable platforms, it has to build spaces that people want to engage with over time, which means you have to have a space people want to spend time in. And so I've seen this argument before, but from my perspective, I actually think Facebook's incentive is pretty strongly aligned with tackling this problem. And a really good example of this is if you look at sort of some of the work of my team, directly designed to counter actors that are trying to exploit and increase the sort of conflict you see on public debate, you see this going down, right? We see that these influence operations are getting caught sooner. We see that the actors behind this, and I should note, we're not just talking about governments here. A lot of the people who use these techniques are financially motivated that are trying to directly profit on outrage, right? They're trying to just build up outrage and then make money off it, whether that's through selling merchandising or building communities or through advertising. We're seeing those communities get less effective, and we're seeing them move off platform to open internet sites or to other platforms with less restrictive controls. And then to the extent that they use our platform and other platforms like ours, they use them to amplify them because they know they're going to get caught. And so I think it's really like, we want to be thinking about ongoing and sustained engagement. We want to be thinking about communities that we want to be part of, which means we have to tackle this problem. Now, the other thing that I would say is, I thought Anne and Peter's piece was really interesting. And I liked, they did a lot of it, they anchored to Tocqueville and his analysis and the way he looked at the United States. And I think one of the things that's really important is de Tocqueville anchors a lot of his belief in the US system in federalism. And in the fact that if you look at the United States, you have a national conversation built up of state conversations, built up of county conversations, built up of town hall conversations, right? And speaking as a Vermonter, the town hall has a very special place in my heart, right? I think one of the biggest challenges we're grappling with is that that stack is hugely collapsed. And it was collapsed by national media, but it's really been collapsed by the internet. And I think the example of Trump and other voices that can speak directly to the entire country in this way, there are some really good things about the collapse of that stack and the opening of the Overton window. If you look at the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, they were driven by the fact that we've been able to open up the Overton window. And I think that's incredibly powerful. But I also think a bunch of the protections that were built into the United States, or this notion that you have different levels of conversation and issues move through them, which means they get moderated. And we've collapsed that. And I think we are trying to figure out as a country, how do you still maintain the sort of reality of democracy and public debate in that new world?
That's great. And I want to put a similar question to you, Ellen. I mean, media companies are facing the same problem, right? I mean, some place like the Washington Post, you describe these very careful procedures you put in place in advance of the election. You know, we don't jump on any story. We think carefully, we slow down, we take our time, we try to figure out what they're trying to achieve. But meanwhile, like there's internet sites running for it, you know, and other companies kind of throwing that stuff out there. And so there is some competitive pressure to kind of not slow down, to go fast, and to maybe not do your homework in the same way. So how do media companies sort of address a similar kind of threat? Like on the one hand, to be able to address this long-term issue of misinformation, you need the time to slow down, to assess, to really understand the problem, to know where the information is coming from. On the other hand, you're facing all these pressures from competitors who are getting out there fast. And how does someplace like the Washington Post manage that challenge? And I will also note that after you answer, we're going to turn to Q&A. So if you haven't put your questions, if you have questions that you're in the audience and haven't yet put it in the Q&A box, please go ahead and add it. So please go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other points in Marty Baron's guidelines was that we should not just rush to tweet out something that another news organization or website has tweeted out just because it's interesting or sexy, before we know, for instance, that it might, that it's actually real or authentic news, especially if it's something as sensational as, an apparent, something that came from a hacked email that was dumped to affect the election. But there is a great deal of competitive pressure on the newsroom to get news out first and get it up. But at the same time, I think the Post is very cognizant that it's not good just to be first. You have to be right. We have a responsibility to our readers to be as responsible as possible in the way we go about our reporting, because basically in the end, our credibility is the realm of the coin of the realm. And if we do not preserve that trust and credibility, then that's our business model. We'll lose, then our readership will go down. And so even if there are other news sites, smaller news sites, whatever, that are putting up information that might be salacious or sexy, we shouldn't be rushing to follow it. We just have to keep our heads in this, brave new world of burgeoning types of media and media sites. We just have to keep our heads down and do our work as we see best and fit.
Great. Well, I have many more questions for you both, but I want to let our audience in. So I'm going to turn over to Ted. Thank you so much. And Ted will turn to our many great questions that we've already received from the audience.
First of all, yeah, thank you so much, Ona, Ellen, Nathaniel. This has been great so far. We have a lot of questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll try our best to sort of identify some of the themes and get through as many of these as we can. Just sticking with you, Ellen, we have a question from one of our fellows, Matt Ferraro, about lessons learned from disinformation in elections that apply to disinformation in other areas. In your reporting, are you getting a sense now that this is sort of a more coordinated government approach that is not just centered around elections, but looks at domestic extremism or the anti-vaxxing campaigns or other forms of influence operations that don't necessarily focus on elections in particular and are coordinating better the way that we try to counter these threats?
I think that's a really good question. Disinformation in any form is something that I think is just much more in the forefront of people's minds. And there is a great deal of attention being paid now by the Biden administration to both domestic violent extremism, the need to get people vaccinated, all of these big challenges need to be grappled with good information. And when they see disinformation or information that's designed to try to mislead people about the need to get vaccinated or about issues that give rise to domestic terrorism, then I think yes, they need to and want to try to compel it. I don't know that they have disinformation task forces around each specific issue area here, but I know that they're very keen to that issue. And you saw the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, last fall set up that myth debunking site. And it was around the election, but a lot of it also tended to kind of surface some of the misinformation, disinformation that kind of fed the election, but around, for instance, vaccines and things, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Nathaniel, we have a lot of questions about the criteria you look for when sort of removing, I guess, what you call coordinated inauthentic behavior on Facebook. Do you distinguish between foreign and domestic? Is it a different criteria, or sort of similar to what you were saying with ABC? Are you looking at really just the behaviors and whether they are being inauthentic? Can you just give us a sense of how you think about that a little more? And related to that, we also have a question about this new Facebook oversight board, which I know is not entirely in your area of purview, but are these the sorts of areas that you could envision, outside oversight, or an independent board, providing guidance to you and your team?
Sure. So first, what I would say is the criteria that we use, if you look in our community standards, there's a section in our community standards called inauthentic behavior, and it defines exactly the thresholds that we use here. It defines the concept of coordinated inauthentic behavior and what we need to see in order to take action. What I will say is effectively what we're looking for is a network of pages, groups, and accounts that are working together to mislead people about who is behind them, and that they are centrally relying on fake accounts to do that. So CIB is actually intended to be a specific subcomponent of influence operations. Not all influence operations are CIB, right? And there is a very clear threshold. If a network does not rely on fake accounts to mislead people, it's not CIB, as far as we're concerned. And that has been a line that we've drawn very intentional. Now, if you look at the inauthentic behavior section in our community standards, you'll see there's a bunch of other enforcement we do if it doesn't rise to the level of CIB. I wouldn't want people to think that CIB is the only enforcement we do, or if we intended to be the solution to the entire problem. It's not. It is designed to tackle, think about it like this. Imagine that there's a pyramid of all of the violations, all of the harmful or bad actors on the platform, right? CIB is the very tip of that pyramid. It's the most sophisticated threat actors. It's the ones that work the hardest. It's the ones that are the most adversarial. Whenever we investigate one of these networks, we have a team of human investigators that runs through, determines that there's a violation. We then review that with our broader team. It then gets escalated to leadership. It goes through 3 levels of review before we take action. In addition, we announce these publicly. So every month we put out a public report that announces the CIB takedowns we did in the last month. We've done these, we have been announcing these publicly for some time. We've been doing them in monthly reports certainly for the last 6 or 8 months. I don't remember exactly when we started, but it's been more than a year. We've done more than 100 announcements of CIB networks from around the world just in the last couple of months. We, speaking to the point about how this is a global challenge, we announced networks being run by the Thai military and targeting public debate in Thailand, linked to Russian actors in Russia that were targeting public debate around Navalny, and linked to the Ugandan government in the lead up to their election quite recently. So we announce these publicly so that people can see them, and then we share information with third-party researchers so that they can sort of conduct their own independent assessment. There's a lot of focus on what we do here, and anytime we take down an influence operation, chances are it's around a critical civic event, and that either a government or a group of people are going to be unhappy with the fact that we took it down. And that means that being consistent and public about the fact that we're doing this based on behavior has been important to us. Now, one footnote, we do make a distinction between foreign or government interference and any other kind of CIB by a non-government actor within a country. The threshold to enforce is the same, but if it is a foreign actor or a government, the consequences are a little bit bigger. In our experience, foreign actors doing this or governments doing this are often the most malicious. And so we throw a wider net to make sure that that network is down and will be less effective going forward.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Nathaniel's comments also about regulation, Ellen also touched off a lot of questions. And I'm curious from your reporting perspective, what you see to be the appetite either in Congress or in the executive branch for providing greater regulatory clarity for social media, for disinformation, what that might look like. Is this an area that you've been thinking about or hearing about? And then from your perspective too, just, is this an area where you think some greater clarity could assist some of the government organization and private sector collaboration that you were just talking about earlier?
I definitely think this is an area that could benefit by more clarity. I haven't been following the regulation debate that closely in the last 6 months or so. So Nathaniel is probably far more up on that, though I will not say I've noticed Facebook itself and Mark Zuckerberg basically begging for come regulate me, come regulate us, right? In the last year, I mean, all the ads for regulation are out there. Every podcast I listen to has, in the daily podcast, has a note from Facebook talking about the need for some regulation. But at the same time, and I do think that actually, come think of it, I do sense that there is a stronger appetite for regulation on the Hill. You've heard it. Actually, ever since 2016, the tide started shifting. Democrats and Republicans started calling for a need to hold Facebook or social media accountable. I think the people that the Biden administration are bringing into the administration on tech issues show that they may be taking a more robust or critical or skeptical eye toward social media. So I do think we might be seeing something on the horizon. Exactly what form or shape that will take, I don't know. Be curious to hear your thoughts, Nathaniel.
Yeah.
I think it's really hard to predict what form it will take. If you look at the principles we put out on influence operations, we talked about a few different things. I think that you can do some really effective things by standardizing the way that companies are transparent and the way that companies tackle these challenges, creating some guidelines around that and expectations there. I also think that there is some important work that could be done in the information sharing space to help companies be able to share information to tackle these challenges more effectively. And then third, I actually think deterrence is a really important component in this equation. We talk a lot about changing the behavior of the platforms, and I do think there are ways that regulation should constrain us. But let's remember, there are a set of bad actors that are doing this, and we have certain things we can do in terms of deterrence. We can announce it publicly. We can expose their tactics. We can take their operations down. But at the end of the day, that is only a certain component of deterrence. If you're going to have more significant deterrence, you need regulatory or legislative signals on where the line is and what the consequences are for crossing the line.
Ellen, you've done a lot of reporting on the SolarWinds and exchange hacks. We have a great question here from Nick Burrell, one of our students, noting that, compared to 2016, which is sort of a phishing attack and the hack kind of a hack and dump operation, we're seeing a lot more of these sophisticated exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities. Do you think how does this play into potentially disinformation or influence operations? Are we reaching a kind of a more sophisticated area now where it's maybe not just about, is it the person, using a fake account, but, how do we even know what the identity is or the authenticity of voices? Is there a sort of a next level of sophistication that we could be approaching and that you've witnessed in some of your reporting?
A lot of different questions packed into one there. I guess I'll pull out at one of them. There's a concern about, always a concern about attribution and the ability of the government to, with high confidence, know who is behind a particular event. And at the same time, the event also, you have to, when you're analyzing it in terms of what the US response should be, what kind of event is it? Are we looking at just a hack for espionage purposes, which is, after all, something that all governments engage in as an activity as old as time, something that states would not want to unilaterally give up? Or is it something more? Was it disruptive? Was it espionage that was carried out through a very debilitating supply chain hack, for instance? And does that change your analysis? I think those are the sorts of questions that are being debated right now by the administration as they figure out whether and how to respond to the SolarWinds hack of the federal government and private sector. And then you also have to look at what are your tools that are available, and are they actually going to have the impact you want them to have? Sanctions, Russia has been heavily sanctioned over the years and still seems to continue to carry out its malign acts, hacking the Ukraine electric grid, trying to carry out influence operations in 2020. It wasn't successful, but it still tried. So do you still want to try to sanction them for that? Those are also policy questions that turn in part on the technical aspects of whether or not you can prove this was the SVR, the GRU, were they using deep fakes, were they going through the supply chain? But those are all elements of operations that we're all now we have to be aware of as we discuss what to do about them.
Thank you. Nathaniel, we have a few questions about artificial intelligence. Do you see AI and machine learning tools as, again, sort of a next level of where disinformation and influence activities are going? Are you already seeing that? Or in the reverse, does this sort of hold out the hope on the Facebook end, on your end of your team, that this is a potential tool for monitoring or identifying types of influence activities online?
I mean, the short answer to some degree is yes. I think artificial intelligence is going to change things on both sides of this equation. We've already seen influence operations that use GAN-generated photos, that is deepfakes, to make fake accounts look more real. We've seen actors using this. But there's an interesting point here. It hasn't helped them very much. Our detection framework is focused on behavior, and it's focused on the way these accounts act. Having a GAN-generated photo doesn't change that. And so we're still seeing these networks get caught. We have seen, now obviously it might make it harder for some open source researchers to identify, but the truth is, even there's enough analysis of what deepfake photos look like that it has actually proved as a tool or a hook for some researchers to find and track these operations. On the other side, what I have found that is most useful is to remember that AI is not a silver bullet. It's not like a magic system where we'll be able to use to tackle every challenge. And so we combine automated systems that are driven by machine learning and AI with expert investigation. And when you put the two of these together, you see the most effective response. And this is true in the influence operations space. It's true in the cybersecurity space as well, right? The biggest challenge that I think we face in the cybersecurity world and in the influence operations world is to defend against these threats, you're essentially looking for a needle in a haystack made of needles. There are so many indicators of threat at any given time. The vast majority of them are very low quality and don't suggest any particular risk. But the ones that are very serious often don't look that different from the ones that are not so serious. And human investigators don't have the capacity to track through all of that and figure out what to prioritize. At the same time, automated systems, no matter how well you design them, expert teams will figure out ways around them. They will figure out how to get around them. They will figure out how to break them. And it's important to remember that in security, we often think about walls, but all walls are climbable. What you're doing when you put controls in place is you're slowing down the bad guys. If you combine these two, though, you have automated systems that slow down the threat actors and filter out most of the noise so that your human experts can focus on the most important signals. In combination, it's incredibly powerful for defense. So I think we're going to see it help both sides, but I do see some really powerful ways it has already helped us, and I think will continue to help us on the defense side.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Ellen, we have a few questions about alleged American interference in the domestic affairs of other countries and how powerful a narrative that can be from an influence operations perspective. And of course, you did all this award-winning reporting on the Russian interference in 2016. How powerful do you think that a motivating factor that is from like, does Mr. Putin really, in your view, or the folks that you've spoken to about this, like things like this idea that the Panama Papers were somehow behind, was a United States operation, or America's interfering in colored revolutions? How does this play from the narrative of other countries' influence operations into the United States?
Yeah, I do think that Putin felt that meddling in fact, the ODNI report the other day said as much as that Putin and the Kremlin feel that meddling in U.S. elections is justified given the efforts that they see as that America has made, United States has made over the years to try to affect their domestic affairs, and in their view try to overturn a regime. Putin is convinced that the United States has wanted to work to undermine and overturn get him out of office, and that color revolutions were all about that Americans were behind the Panama Papers. And so in his mind, yes, this sort of tit for tat, or carrying out an influence operation in America is perfectly justifiable.
Yeah, thank you for that. Nathaniel, just in terms of how you think about foreign countries, we also have some questions here. When you with Facebook gets a request from another country about content concerns, do you use the same criteria as you would in the US context? So if it is a country that might have a different value system with respect to human rights, or cracking down on dissidents, or authoritarian control, just give us a bit of a sense of how you grapple with that internally in your organization.
Sure, but one thing that I want to say quickly first, just because I did see there are a bunch of questions about foreign versus domestic, and foreign's important, but what about domestic? We're talking a lot about foreign threats here, and that is obviously an important part of our focus, but I wouldn't want to suggest that we aren't also focused on domestic actors. I think there's a lot of important work to be done in the domestic space, and there's a reason that our enforcement policies are built so that we can use them against both foreign and domestic actors. And domestic here doesn't necessarily mean within the United States, but actors who live within a country or a region and are targeting public debate within that same country or region. Now, to the question about operating in other countries, I got to this a little bit earlier, right? I think one of the bigger challenges here is we're operating in countries around the world, and not all countries share the commitment to open public debate that we have here in the United States. In fact, many don't. When we're operating within a country, when we get requests or law enforcement requests, we obviously have to comply with the law of the country we're operating in. But when we get in requests, we review them based on our community standards. And we're only going to take action on something if it violates our community standards. So one of the thresholds that we've put is we want tips. We want people to suggest to us that something might be in violation of our policies. We want people to share information with us, but we only take action if it violates our community standards. And so we get information in from a bunch of places, and that lets us analyze it. And then we determine if it violates our community standards and take action based on that.
Thank you for that. We have a question just related to this, Nathaniel, about the role of subnational governments. Could you envision a situation where Facebook's working with state actors on some of these questions, particularly around elections? Or have you already done that? Give us a sense of who your constellation of your outreach entities would look like from your perspective. Who are your key points of contact? I mean, you mentioned that you were doing these weekly conversations with the federal government. Who are some of the other key groups from your perspective that you need to be engaged with?
So in terms of protecting an election, in the context of the United States, we were closely connected with state level officials as well, particularly election officials across the state, and including in some cases, local or county officials. One of the things that we've seen is that if you are in a county or you are a local or regional official, you're going to see threat trends early. You might see something that's happening and be able to tip it to us so that we can identify it and take action against it across the country. So one of the things we built for the 2020 election, we've used for other major elections around the world. We have an operations center, which basically brings together the dozens of teams in Facebook that work on elections integrity. It's up and running. It could be weeks or months in advance of an election and then after the election. And it's taking in information. And one of the key reasons it's there is it takes in information from our contacts at state elections, boards, law enforcement, federal elections, at the other platforms, in civil society, so that when someone sees something, we can identify it and act very quickly on it. And we actually, an interesting example of this is from the Brazilian elections, where we identified, you're talking about regional nuances, in the elections in Brazil not that long ago, we identified a sort of new type of slur that was effectively growing very, very quickly in public debate in Brazil in the lead up to the election. And it was targeted at people from a particular region within the country. And it didn't necessarily fit into our existing thresholds to determine what constitutes a slur or hate speech. And we were able to very quickly, within a matter of hours, identify it, see that it was spreading, update our policies, and take action on it because we had that very quick, rapid response system in place.
Thank you. We're running out of time here. Ellen, we had a lot of questions about the decision to remove former President Trump from these platforms, not just Facebook, but other social media platforms. And you alluded to, this challenge of a lot of the disinformation, coming from the president himself. What did some of as you look back on some of the reporting on this and think a little bit about where we are now, was this the right decision? Did it take too long? What are some of the precedent issues that are raised by this? There will be an oversight board at Facebook that's going to look at this decision. I'm just kind of curious in your what you've heard about reactions to this.
Look, just gauging from reactions on Twitter, there was a lot of positive reaction, I think, to the takedown or the deplatforming of the former president, with some people saying what took so long. Twitter even getting some grief for not having acted sooner and doing so only after it looked like there might be moves toward regulation. But there were also a number of people who were critical of the move in terms of, well, now what are you going to do about other foreign leaders who say who put out misleading things online? And I think, it's a tough question, but I think if I may express a personal view, I think platforms are not the U.S. government and have a right to create their own community standards and guidelines and terms of service, and then abide by them. So, I would be curious to know what Nathaniel thinks of that policy move. And you're smiling there, Nathaniel, not to put you on the spot.
Well, we have 1 minute remaining. So had we gotten to 1:15, I would have given Nathaniel a pass, but I'll just give you a quick comment, Nathaniel, and we'll wrap up.
And I mean, the truth is, right, we took an action, we've referred it to the oversight board, they're going to be ruling, so there isn't too much that I could say here. But I will say that I think consistency in spaces like this is really important. I think we have community standards and we should enforce them. But I also think the question of how you do this consistently around the world is really challenging, which is why we're watching the oversight board ruling and we're watching to see what comes next.
Thank you, Nathaniel. All right, it's 1:15. We got through as many of these as we could. We've answered more than are remaining, but it's been a great discussion. And back over to you, Ona.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Ellen and Nathaniel, for a fantastic conversation. We could easily keep going all afternoon. There's so much to discuss, but we have managed, I think, to dig into some of the key issues. So we're grateful to you both for that. Thank you. And we hope all of you who are here watching will join us again in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about organizing to address cyber threats. I will tell you that in the past, when we've covered this issue, I myself have found it fascinating, sort of what happens when a cyber attack occurs. What does the response look like from the inside? What are the steps that are taken? And I always learn from this conversation. So hopefully you'll join us in 2 weeks and continue learning with us. But thank you again, Ellen and Nathaniel. And thank you to Ted for a great conversation. And we'll look forward to the rest of the conversations to come.
All right, be well, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.